Hello Internet, what is going on? Welcome back to my kitchen. So this week we read a book about the collapse of society and societal collapse in general. And I've been kind of reading more about the limits of planet Earth and societies and a lot of kind of bursting of the bubble, you may say, of humanity. And it kind of, it seems dark, I guess, at first, but it's really not. For me, it's more important to look at the problem and to look at a variety of problems and kind of zoom out and look at the wider perspective to see exactly what potential issues we could face in the future, to see what things we can do today that have the biggest impact. And this was a mind opener, this book, because when looking at my previous perspective, thinking about how I saw society in the past, I was kind of like a teenager that was very ignorant and felt that they were invincible, basically, that nothing can kill them or hurt them. And that's the way I felt about humanity and society in general today, and where we are with all the technological advances and how interconnected we are through different types of interwebs and things like that. But that assumption has been busted. So when reading this book and reading around this book, around this topic throughout this week, I've realized that societal collapse is the norm. That's the normal thing that happens all the time. The anomaly is civilizations and societies that sustain and maintain for long periods of time. That's the unique thing. And when you look at all these different societies throughout time, I think the average lifespan is 336 years. And the thing that sticks around and what makes humanity last for long periods of time is basically small, decentralized, simplified communities. They're like kind of the cockroaches of humanity. They last long and they've gotten us to where we are today. So I'm not going to go into the entirety of this book, but I do want to talk about a few things that have been boiling and kind of rolling around in my head, and also some interesting insights I pulled from the book itself. So what makes a society complex is basically what makes society collapse. Because any society that expands beyond a certain number and has a certain type of complexity, they tend to start to fold in on themselves. And complexity is defined in this book basically that it's the increase of population, but also the increase of specialties and roles within that population. So it's not just the size of the population, but the diversity of it. And there's many reasons why a society might fail. But if you look at the theory that this guy's laid out, basically, is that there's one consistent pattern across all of these societies. And the consistent pattern is interesting because it's something that we're all aware of, at least most of us, which is the law of diminishing returns. And I'll show a little Dragon Ball Z chart here. I thought it was pretty cool. And the premise of law of diminishing returns is that you basically derive some sort of return, so you get some sort of return from effort, and that continues to increase. But once you get to a peak of this graph, you start to diminish the returns that you get from the effort you've put in. And another way that could be explained is the return on investment, right? So investors and financiers out there and stuff is when you invest in something, you expect some sort of return from it. And that return you expect to be more than you've invested, so you can continually do this in a sustainable way. Well, societies throughout time have actually started out with a good return on their investment, but over time that return has actually diminished. And that diminishing return has actually inverted over time. And once it inverts, that collapse starts to happen for those societies. An example, he's given many examples in the book, but one example that resonated most with me is one of the most prominent societies that's ever existed on the planet, which is the Roman Empire. And there's many reasons why they've collapsed as well, but the theory across this is basically, as the Roman Empire expanded geographically, they started to conquer many different civilizations. And as they expanded, they needed to have more soldiers, they needed to have more administration to deal with all the governmental and law-abiding things, but they also needed more food and they needed more materials, etc. And as they expanded, the majority of the time, the places that they conquered could fund that expansion. But eventually they got to the point where the places they were conquering wasn't actually covering the cost for doing the expansion in itself. So the empire had to pay for it. They had to pay for it out of their own pocket. And paying for it out of their own pocket, eventually ran out of capital and they ran out of resources. Not just currency, but food and the things that matter. So it's the complexity of society that actually eventually kills it out. So the more growth a society has, the more complex it becomes, the more resources and energy needs to be put into it to sustain it. And once those resources and energies become depleted and the returns you're getting on that investment disappear, then that society starts to either collapse in on itself, or it has to fundamentally have some sort of new jump in innovation and technology to start that exponential growth again. And that was a previous book that I read called Scale that kind of walks you through that idea, how it's an assumption that's based on fallacies and might not work out as well. And some of the thoughts I've been having over the last couple of weeks, and I'm sure many of you have had similar thoughts, is that I've never realized how dependent and reliant I am upon the ecosystem that I sit inside of. And when I say ecosystem I sit inside of is basically kind of the capitalistic world that we're a part of, where I give you a piece of paper and you give me some sort of service or product in return. And that reliance comes in many shapes and forms, but I guess the thing that hit me the hardest were the essentials that mattered most, which is going to the grocery store for food, getting your utilities from an energy company, water, shelter from a landlord, etc. And not just being reliant upon those people to get those services and those things with a piece of paper, but also the abstracted knowledge that I've given to those individuals. So I've basically abstracted so far away from reality that I'm kind of like an infant. So if you, or domesticated dog is another one, where you basically, if you tossed me into the woods and said survive, or you said grow your own food or something, I don't have the knowledge or the know-how to do any of that. So I'm basically like a baby, and I need people to help me, and I can give them currency in return for that service, but it's concerning to me. And yes, I know that in a society that favors technology and favors understanding of data science, machine learning, and different forms of statistics and science and things like that, I agree that's all important and that's great. But it's just a shock to me, and I'm sure a shock to many of my friends, of how abstracted they are away from these core essential bits of knowledge to know how to do certain things. An analogy that I thought about in this realm of I guess abstraction and reliance upon people around me is picture yourself basically laying in one of those deathbeds, right? So you're laying in a deathbed, or not a deathbed, but you're laying in a hospital bed, right? And you have all these IVs attached to your body, so you're connected with all these cords. And each one of these cords could be a reliance that you have on an external system. And if any one of these cords are pulled, you won't necessarily die immediately, but you'll slowly start to deteriorate unless you replace that cord with something else. And some of the cords I thought of were basically shelter. So your landlord has a cord attached to you for shelter. Then the grocery store has attached to you for food, and the utilities companies has attached for electricity, the water company for water, sewage company for sewage and disposal of waste, and all these variety of things that we find as essentials to survive. And in that, I guess that realm of thought of being attached to all these cords, I realized, I say over the last couple of weeks and months, that I want to become as independent as possible, to have an independent life in the essentials, right? So I'm not saying I want to detach from society, because if you know me at all, and my friends know and family, that I'm obsessed with technology and I think it's great, and I would never want to detach from any of that. But being able to be independent and not reliant upon others for the essentials that matter most is something that I think would bring a lot of confidence, security, and a sense of calm in the way that I go about my life and the way that I think about things. And I'm not saying all this to terrify you, to say that society is going to collapse and you should become a full-on prepper and live off-grid, etc., etc. I'm not saying that to kind of make you think that. I'm saying this to ask you to question what I've questioned over the last couple of months, which is, what have I abstracted away from my own knowledge, and what am I reliant upon, and am I okay with that? Because if you are, that's great. But for me personally, my goal is to set up some sort of infrastructure and design an independent life around the essentials. And yes, that may be kind of the weird conspiracy stuff where you have a home off-grid and you have a piece of land, and off-grid sense of you're not attached to an infrastructure for utilities or electricity or water. You have a garden that's basically designed around permaculture, so it's sustainable and it's producing more than you're putting into it. And all these variety of things, all these skill sets, all this knowledge is something that I would like to eventually get and design around my own life. Not to detach from society, but to be more independent and to be more confident and calm in my ability to support myself when it comes to the essentials. So my question to you is how abstracted are you away from reality? And also how dependent are you upon the external system around you? Internet, this was a good one. I enjoyed this book. I enjoyed this week's research. I will see you next week. Mwah.